In 2013, a young boy named Jeremiah Oliver vanished without a trace. At first, it seemed like a routine missing child case. A small boy, only 5 years old, gone from the life of his family. But what started as a disappearance quickly spiraled into something far darker. Something so horrifying that even the most seasoned detectives admitted they had never seen anything like it in their careers. Imagine a child, full of laughter, full of life. A little boy who loved Spider-Man, toy cars, and the simple joys that every 5-year-old deserves. A child who should have been safe, who should have been protected, yet was left completely vulnerable to the cruelty of the very people entrusted to care for him. Jeremiah's story is not just a story of loss. It is a story of unimaginable violence. A story where innocence was destroyed in ways that will shake you to your core. Where every day of his short life was marked by fear, manipulation, and abuse. And when the truth finally came to light, it stunned an entire community, leaving police officers, investigators, and neighbors alike questioning how anyone could commit such acts against a child. No one expected what they would find. No one could prepare for the horror waiting at the end of this twisted trail. Jeremiah wasn't just missing. He had been discarded, hidden away. A life ended in secrecy and silence. A life wrapped in a suitcase, abandoned on the side of a highway. And yet, even in the face of such darkness, there were clues, there were moments, and there were decisions that could have changed everything. Moments overlooked. Warnings ignored. Red flags dismissed. How could the system, how could a family, allow something so horrific to happen? The story you are about to hear will make you question the very nature of human cruelty. It will make you cry. It will make your heart ache for a child who never had the chance to live the life he deserved. And it will make you wonder, how could something so monstrous go unnoticed for so long? This is not just a true crime story. This is the story of Jeremiah Oliver. A child who deserved to be loved. A child who deserved protection. A child whose life ended in the most brutal, unforgiving way imaginable. And the question remains, why? If you want to understand the full story, to follow the path of this case from the first moment Jeremiah disappeared to the shocking discoveries that followed, make sure you stay with me. And make sure you subscribe, because this is a story that demands attention. A story that the world cannot forget. Before I begin, let me ask you where you watching from? Drop your city in the comment below. I will like to know how far Jeremiah's story is going. Jeremiah Oliver was a 5-year-old boy with a smile that could light up a room. He was like any other child, full of energy, curiosity, and wonder about the world around him. A little boy who loved playing outside, running after his friends, and filling his days with laughter. Like most kids his age, Jeremiah was fascinated by superheroes. Spider-Man was his favorite. His room was filled with Spider-Man toys. His favorite red and blue costume always at the ready for when it was time to play. He'd run around, pretending to swing through the air, imagining himself saving the day, protecting the ones he loved. He had big dreams, just like any other 5-year-old. Dreams of being a police officer one day, of helping people, of making the world a better place. He was the type of child who could find joy in the smallest of things, rolling his toy cars across the floor for hours, laughing at silly cartoons, or sitting down with his siblings to share a meal. His favorite moments were spent with family, whether it was a quiet evening in front of the TV, or a playful game in the yard. Simple moments. To anyone who met him, Jeremiah was just a regular little boy, a child with a full life ahead of him. He wasn't just a name, a face, or a statistic. Jeremiah was a son, a brother, a nephew, and a friend. He was someone's child, someone's beloved little boy. He had all the promise of youth, those precious years when everything is new, when the world is vast and full of possibilities. But there was something about Jeremiah that set him apart from other children his age, something that many might not have seen. Jeremiah, despite his innocence, had already begun to experience the world in ways no child ever should. His laughter and play were slowly being overshadowed by a darkness that no 5-year-old should ever have to face. Behind the scenes, his home life was becoming a battleground. His mother, Elsa Oliver, had recently entered into a relationship with a man named Alberto Sierra Jr. At first, everything seemed fine. It appeared like a regular family dynamic. But things began to shift in the background. Things that no one noticed. Not the teachers, not the neighbors, not even his own family. What should have been a safe space, his home, began to crumble, and Jeremiah was caught in the middle of it. The love and innocence he so clearly exuded. His superhero dreams, his toy cars, his games of pretend, were slowly but surely being replaced by something much darker. By 2013, the year his life was stolen from him, Jeremiah's world had begun to change, but no one outside his home knew just how much. No one knew the fear that had begun to creep into his heart, the confusion he must have felt as his once safe and joyful world became something he couldn't understand. Jeremiah didn't have the tools, the voice, or the strength to fight back against what was happening inside his home. And though he was loved by his family, those who should have cared for him most, something began to slip through the cracks. Small changes at first, his mother's new relationship, the shifts in family dynamics. But those small changes grew larger, more noticeable. And yet, no one seemed to see the signs, or no one acted on them. As innocent as he was, as full of joy as he appeared, the truth was that Jeremiah could never escape the darkness that was creeping into his life. His disappearance would go unnoticed by many. No one raised an alarm when he was no longer seen at school, or when his absence didn't seem to raise any red flags in the community. His sister, Juliana, was the one who finally spoke up. But by then, it was too late. You see, the story of Jeremiah Oliver is not just a story of a lost child. It's a story of a life cut short far too soon. A life that should have been full of laughter, play, and discovery. Instead, Jeremiah's life ended with fear, pain, and a betrayal so deep, it's almost impossible to comprehend. What happened to Jeremiah was not an accident. It was not some random act of fate. It was something far worse. And it all began with the destruction of a young boy's innocence. Long before he was found abandoned in a suitcase on the side of a highway, his tiny body hidden in the cold brush by a road. How did it happen? How did we fail him? The answer to that question will haunt you as we go deeper into this story. Before I continue, I just want to take a moment to thank all of my amazing subscribers who have been supporting this channel. Your encouragement helps keep these stories alive and gives me the motivation to keep creating and sharing content with you. These videos take time, effort, and heart to produce, and your support means the world to me. Now, if you're feeling the weight of this story and can't help but want to hear more about what happened to little Jeremiah, please do me a favor. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share the story with someone who might not know about it. It's so important that we keep his memory alive and make sure his voice is never forgotten. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so that you'll be the first to know whenever I drop another heart-wrenching story that demands attention. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Jeremiah's family seemed ordinary at first. Like so many others, they had their share of struggles and joys, their highs and lows. Elsa Oliver, his mother, was just like any other parent trying to balance the demands of life, work, and raising 3 young children. She had her moments of joy with them, moments when they were a family like any other. Laughing together, sharing meals, playing games in the yard. But the reality of family life is often much more complicated than the picture-perfect moments we see from the outside. For Elsa, the challenges were mounting. Her marriage had ended, and she found herself raising her children on her own for the most part. It was hard, but it was manageable. At least, that's what it appeared to be. Jeremiah, his older sister Juliana, and their younger sibling were all adjusting to life in a new town after they moved from New Britain, Connecticut, to Fitchburg, Massachusetts in 2013. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance for Elsa to give her children the stability and love they deserved. But what started as a new chapter soon took a disturbing turn. Elsa met Alberto Sierra Jr., a man in his early 20s, and what seemed like a harmless new relationship quickly began to alter the dynamics of their home. At first, things were subtle. Elsa's new partner was young, charming, and seemingly eager to help. He was a presence in the home, helping with daily routines, helping with the kids. His presence in the house, while new, was initially viewed as just another part of the process of rebuilding. But what started as a typical relationship soon began to shift. The man who had entered the home as a partner to Elsa soon started taking on a role he wasn't prepared for. He began to exert control. Slowly but surely, his influence over the children and the home grew. The happy, chaotic dynamics of their family life began to change. He wasn't just a boyfriend anymore. He was becoming a dominant figure in the home, one that was not interested in love or support, but in control. And for Jeremiah, that control turned into something much darker. At first, no one could have known what was happening behind closed doors. Elsa seemed to be in love. Alberto seemed to be doing what was needed to support the family. But slowly, as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, a sense of fear began to settle in. And it was Jeremiah, the youngest, who began to feel the weight of that fear more than anyone else. The tension in the home began to grow. There were quiet signs of instability, shifting moods, occasional arguments, and moments where things didn't feel quite right. But it wasn't just the adults who felt this. Children, even at a young age, are incredibly sensitive to the emotional climate of their home. And Jeremiah, though still young, would have felt that shift. Elsa, who was trying to hold her family together, became increasingly torn between her new relationship and her responsibilities as a mother. At first, it seemed like Alberto was just a support system. But then his behavior became more erratic. The power dynamic in the household shifted from one of shared responsibility to one of control and intimidation. It wasn't long before Alberto started to exert more authority. He was no longer just a boyfriend. He became the one calling the shots, laying down rules that were not for the benefit of the children, but for his own desires and needs. As the months passed, the family's environment began to sour. The light-hearted moments began to diminish. The laughter that had once filled the home was replaced with quiet tension. There were whispers of arguments, a strange coldness in the air, and the subtle changes in the way the children were treated. The child who had once loved running around in his Spider-Man costume, full of joy and curiosity, was now walking on eggshells in his own home. But no one saw the danger. Not at first. Not in the beginning. And no one was able to intervene. As Elsa's relationship with Alberto deepened, it became clear that her judgment had clouded. The man who should have been a partner, a support system for the family, was becoming the primary source of fear. The abuse wasn't physical at first, at least not outwardly. But control and manipulation, emotional abuse, crept in slowly, and Jeremiah, a little boy with no means to protect himself, was the first to feel it. Alberto's role in the household became more about asserting dominance, and as time went on, it became clearer that he was taking on an increasingly authoritative and oppressive role. He became the one who made the rules, who dictated how the children would behave, who decided what was right and wrong. And it wasn't long before that power dynamic turned from subtle control into outright abuse. For Jeremiah, there was no escape from this new environment. He was a little boy, caught between a mother who, perhaps unknowingly, was blinded by her relationship, and a man who had no business being around children, let alone exerting authority over them. There were moments, small signs, where things didn't quite add up. Neighbors began to notice. Family members started to ask questions. Where was Jeremiah? Why wasn't he at school? Why wasn't he being seen in the neighborhood? And why was Elsa's relationship with Alberto becoming more and more complicated? But the danger remained unseen. The signs were there, but no one acted on them. Not the school, not the neighbors, and certainly not the authorities. The family's facade remained in place, even as the cracks began to show. And Jeremiah, the little boy who once had the whole world ahead of him, was being pushed deeper into a world of fear and uncertainty. What should have been his safest place, a loving home, was slowly becoming a prison of emotional and psychological torment. And as that darkness grew, the walls around him closed in. What do you think? Do you believe Elsa saw the signs of danger in Alberto's behavior, Or do you think she was truly blinded by love? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And while you're at it, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I'm always curious to know where my viewers are tuning in from. I read and respond to every comment, and I can't wait to hear from you. As the weeks passed, no one asked where Jeremiah was. At first, his absence from school seemed like a simple oversight. After all, kids get sick, families travel, and sometimes things slip through the cracks. But as days turned into weeks, and those weeks stretched into months, his absence began to raise questions. But oddly enough, no one seemed to notice. Jeremiah wasn't at school. He wasn't out playing with the other kids in the neighborhood. He wasn't even seen at the store with his mother or walking down the sidewalk with his siblings. But despite all of this, there was no alarm. No one questioned where he was, why he wasn't around. No one seemed concerned. His mother, Elsa, explained it away. She told the school and anyone who asked that Jeremiah was in Florida, staying with relatives. It was a simple, believable excuse. It made sense to those who didn't know any better, especially considering that Elsa had once spoken of the possibility of sending the kids to visit family out of state. Who would think twice? Who would dig deeper? Florida was far away. People don't question things that seem simple, things that are easy to explain. But as the days wore on, the silence around Jeremiah grew deafening. His absence was not just from school. It was from the community. The neighbors began to notice that something was off. The Oliver family had always been quiet, but now even that quietness seemed different. There were fewer visitors, fewer family gatherings. And where was Jeremiah? His absence didn't feel like a regular absence anymore. When neighbors spoke of Elsa, they noticed a shift. Her demeanor had changed. She was more reclusive, more distant. The lively energy that had once radiated from their home now felt replaced by an unsettling stillness. But still, no one questioned it. No one thought to check on her, to see if everything was truly okay. The authorities didn't get involved either. It wasn't as if the case was being ignored. No, the truth was far more chilling. They had no reason to look closer. To them, Jeremiah's absence was easily explained. His mother had said he was out of state, so that was that. The lack of follow-up, the lack of deeper inquiry. It wasn't out of malice, but apathy. Jeremiah's case didn't stand out. He was just another missing child. Just another family moving on with their lives. And so the days stretched on with no answers, no real concern. Jeremiah became more than just a missing child. He became a forgotten child. But deep down there was something that gnawed at the edges of the story. The nagging feeling that something was wrong. For weeks, Jeremiah was nowhere to be seen, and yet no one reacted. Not until December. Not until it was almost too late. It was in December when a small, seemingly inconsequential statement would ignite the first spark of alarm. Juliana, Jeremiah's older sister, had grown increasingly worried. She had no idea where her brother was. It had been months since she last saw him, months since she heard his laughter echo through their home. And she knew, deep in her gut, something was off. She was just a child, but she wasn't blind to the absence of her little brother. No one seemed to care, no one seemed to wonder where he had gone. But Juliana couldn't ignore it. She couldn't pretend everything was fine. One day, during a routine school lesson, Juliana spoke up. She confided in a teacher at Ryold Elementary School, telling them that she hadn't seen her brother in months. Her words were simple, but the weight they carried was immense. She told her teacher she was afraid that something was wrong at home. And that was the moment everything started to unravel. That small, quiet conversation in a school classroom, something so simple and yet so powerful, was the first sign of something deeply disturbing. It was the first crack in the wall that had hidden the truth for so long. The teacher, a mandated reporter, did exactly what they were supposed to do. They relayed the information to the authorities. And for the first time in months, the authorities began to take notice. But by now it was December. The search for Jeremiah had been delayed for far too long. His mother's story about him being in Florida had gone unchallenged for months. No one had questioned it. No one had checked. When the authorities arrived at Elsa's apartment, the first thing they were told was that Jeremiah was still in Florida. But something didn't sit right. There were no flight records, no phone calls to relatives, no evidence that Jeremiah had ever left the state. Just a mother's word, a simple explanation, and the disturbing sense that something far darker was unfolding. And so the investigation began, slowly at first, but with a mounting urgency that couldn't be ignored. They dug deeper, trying to confirm the story. They contacted the relatives Elsa claimed had Jeremiah. But there was one problem. The relatives denied any knowledge of him. No one had seen Jeremiah. No one had taken him in. It was all a lie. Suddenly, the case went from a missing child to a full-scale investigation. The police knew something wasn't right. The pieces didn't fit. Jeremiah was missing, and no one had any answers. And this is where the story turns. Because as the police and investigators began their search, they uncovered more than just a child who had gone missing. They uncovered a web of lies, manipulation, and most horrifying of all, a child who had been left to slip through the cracks unnoticed for far too long. It was December 13, 2013, when Fitchburg police executed a search warrant at the Oliver home. Elsa's story was crumbling. She had claimed Jeremiah was in Florida, but now, with no proof to back it up, her lies were starting to unravel. But still, no one had any idea where Jeremiah was. What happened next was even more chilling. With no solid answers, investigators began canvassing the neighborhood. They spoke to neighbors who had seen the family recently, or more accurately, who hadn't seen them. No one could confirm that Jeremiah had been anywhere, not even in Florida. That was when the authorities realized they had been lied to for months. Elsa's story was falling apart. The community was beginning to wake up, to realize that the little boy who had once been full of life and joy was now gone, and no one had cared enough to ask why. Jeremiah's disappearance wasn't a mistake. It wasn't just a case of a child wandering off, or a child who ran away. No, it was something far more sinister. Jeremiah's absence was part of a larger story, one of neglect, abuse, and a system that failed him at every turn. His disappearance wasn't just an oversight, it was a failure on every level, by everyone who should have been looking out for him. The question that now lingered was, how could this have gone unnoticed for so long? How could a 5-year-old child simply vanish, and no one react? Jeremiah wasn't just a missing child. He was a neglected child, a child lost in a system that failed him in ways that no one could ever fully comprehend. As the investigation intensified, the realization hit hard. Jeremiah had been gone for far too long, and the consequences of that silence were only just beginning to unfold. Before we dive deeper into this case, I just want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for being part of this journey. Your support, your comments, your engagement, it all helps fuel these stories. I'm sure you're feeling the tension building up in this case, and I promise, we're just scratching the surface of what happened to Jeremiah. If you believe that no child should ever be forgotten and you want to keep the truth alive, please show your support. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who still believes that every missing child deserves justice. This story needs to be heard by more people, and with your help, we can make sure it reaches those who need to hear it most. And don't forget, hit that notification bell so you'll never miss an update when we uncover the next shocking chapter of this case. Stay tuned, you'll want to be the first to know. It wasn't until December that authorities began to dig deeper. By now, Jeremiah had been missing for months. His absence from the community, from school, from his home, had gone unchallenged for far too long. The more time passed, the more people wondered, where could he be? The longer he remained missing, the slimmer the chances of finding him alive. Every day that passed brought them closer to the truth, but no one knew just how much darker that truth was. Investigators were still piecing together the few clues they had. Elsa's story that Jeremiah was in Florida was unraveling, but there were no concrete answers. No proof. No flight records. No family confirming they had ever seen him. Just lies and more lies. But where was he? If he wasn't in Florida, where was the little boy? Why wasn't anyone seeing the warning signs? The investigation was slow at first, the kind of investigation that often feels like it's not moving at all. But then came the breakthrough. It came from a source no one had expected, an unlikely witness. An inmate serving time in the Worcester County Jail came forward with a tip. He claimed to know the whereabouts of Jeremiah. He knew where the boy's body had been hidden. The information was chilling, too specific to ignore, and yet too horrifying to fully believe. With this new lead, investigators had no choice but to follow it, hoping against hope that they were not walking down a road to a cruel discovery. The tip pointed them to a location off Interstate 190, in Sterling, Massachusetts, a rural stretch of highway, far from the city, in an area that had already been searched several times before. The information was so precise that the authorities had no choice but to act on it immediately. At first, there was hesitation. Could this be real? Was this tip just another false lead? But there was something about it, something in the details that made it impossible to ignore. This tipster had mentioned a suitcase discarded on the side of the highway, hidden in the brush, far from the busy roads where most people would drive. It was exactly the kind of place where someone desperate to hide something might think no one would ever look. And so the search began. Investigators and police officers gathered their teams and headed to the location. The area was familiar to them, a spot they had visited many times in the past few months. But this time, the tip was different. This time, there was hope. As they scoured the area, their hearts raced with the fear of what they might find. But there was no turning back now. Hours passed. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the patch of roadside brush. And then it happened. A faint outline of something that didn't belong, half hidden beneath the overgrown grass and wild bushes. It was a suitcase. Just like the tipster had said. It was a moment frozen in time, one that investigators would never forget. As they moved closer, their breaths held, they slowly and carefully examined the suitcase, unsure of what they might find inside. Could it really be Jeremiah? Could this be the moment they had all been waiting for? They opened it carefully, one slow movement at a time, hoping against hope that the suitcase would hold only clothing, or perhaps even nothing at all. But as the suitcase opened, the horror became clear. Inside was the body of a child. The body was that of a little boy, and the resemblance was unmistakable. It was Jeremiah Oliver. His tiny body had been hidden there for months, discarded and abandoned in a place no one would ever expect to find him. The news was devastating. The discovery of Jeremiah's body confirmed what no one had wanted to believe. He was gone. He had been gone for months, and no one had noticed until it was far too late. But now there was no question. Jeremiah had been murdered. For the investigators, the realization that they had found the child they had been searching for so long was a bittersweet victory. They had answers, but those answers came with a deep sense of loss. What had happened to this little boy? What had been done to him? The case took on a new urgency as the investigation shifted from searching for a missing child to searching for the person responsible for his death. With the suitcase discovery, the investigators now had the physical evidence they needed to build their case. But this was only the beginning. The discovery of Jeremiah's body wasn't just a tragic conclusion to a missing persons case. It was the start of an entirely new chapter. A chapter where the true horrors of his life would begin to emerge. A chapter where the detectives, social workers, and authorities would start to piece together the horrifying reality of what had really happened to him. As the news spread, the weight of the discovery sank into the hearts of the community. Those who had known Jeremiah, those who had loved him, were left in shock. There was a deep sense of betrayal, anger, and confusion. How could something so horrible happen to a child? How could this little boy, full of dreams and innocence, be subjected to such violence and cruelty? The investigation intensified. The forensic team arrived, taking photos, collecting evidence, and documenting the crime scene. The suitcase was carefully examined. Jeremiah's body was transported to the medical examiner's office for a full autopsy. But the questions remained. How had this happened? Who could have done this to such a sweet, innocent child? The case was now a homicide, but the answers didn't come easily. Investigators needed to figure out how Jeremiah had ended up in that suitcase. What had led to his death? Had he been killed immediately, or had he suffered for days or even weeks before he died? The answers would come, but slowly, painfully, and with the heartbreaking realization that the truth was far darker than anyone could have ever imagined. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Jeremiah's life had been marked by neglect, manipulation, and violence long before his death. His mother, Elsa Oliver, had been hiding the truth for months, and her story, her excuse about Jeremiah being in Florida, was nothing more than a cover-up. And then there was Alberto Sierra, Elsa's boyfriend, whose role in the family had become increasingly sinister. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Alberto was a central figure in this case. His relationship with Jeremiah had turned violent. The clues were there, small signs that no one had fully understood until it was too late. But for now, the investigators were left with more questions than answers. Who was responsible for this child's death? And how could they prove it? The investigation, which had begun with a missing child and a mother's lie, had now become a race to uncover the truth. And with each new piece of evidence, it became harder to ignore the feeling that Jeremiah's death had been part of something much larger, something more disturbing than anyone had first imagined. As the investigation continued, the emotional toll on the community deepened. The search for justice for Jeremiah had just begun, and it would take every ounce of strength, every resource, and every ounce of determination to uncover the truth and bring those responsible to justice. But as investigators connected the dots, they slowly began to realize the truth was even darker than they had feared. This case took a dark turn when that inmate came forward with a tip. Do you think the police acted quickly enough when they got the tip, or do you think they should have investigated earlier? And hey, let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing how far this story reaches. I read every comment and try to reply to as many as I can, so I look forward to hearing from you all. The moment police opened that suitcase, the horror they found inside would change everything. What they hoped would be an empty bag, a misplaced item, a false lead, was nothing of the sort. What they found instead was a child's lifeless body, hidden away for months in the brush beside a lonely stretch of road. Jeremiah Oliver, 5 years old. Jeremiah was no longer just a missing child. His name, once whispered in fear and uncertainty, was now tied to something far darker. He was no longer a boy who had vanished. He was a tragic victim of unimaginable violence. His tiny, fragile body, once full of life and promise, now lay cold and still, discarded like so much trash by those who should have cared for him most. The suitcase, though seemingly ordinary, had become the macabre vessel for a child's final moments. As the forensic team gently opened the bag, the reality of what they were about to uncover hit them like a wave. It was clear, this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a child who had wandered off or been forgotten. No, this was something far more sinister. Jeremiah's life had been stolen from him, taken by someone who should have protected him, who should have loved him. The team moved with careful precision. Each motion was deliberate. The importance of this moment weighed heavily on their shoulders. They knew what this meant. Jeremiah's body was more than just evidence. It was the answer to a question that had haunted an entire community, that had haunted the investigators for months. What had happened to Jeremiah? As the suitcase was fully opened, a chill fell over the scene. What they found was a child's body, his lifeless form crumpled inside a cheap, worn suitcase, no different from the hundreds of others that passed through freight terminals every day. But inside this one was a tragedy beyond words. The same child who had once laughed, who had once run around in his Spider-Man costume, who had once been full of promise, was now reduced to nothing more than a body, a broken, discarded soul left to rot by the very people who were supposed to love and protect him. Jeremiah's body was small, cold, and lifeless, but the evidence of violence was there. His injuries, though not immediately obvious, were the kind of silent markers that screamed of brutality and neglect. His body had been exposed to the harsh elements of the roadside brush for months, hidden from the world, unnoticed and abandoned. This discovery wasn't just a turning point in the investigation. It was the end of a long, painful journey. Up until this moment, the authorities had clung to the faint hope that Jeremiah might still be alive, that there was a chance of him being found safe, perhaps scared but unharmed. But that hope was shattered in an instant. The body was Jeremiah. The moment the suitcase was opened, the weight of that loss hung heavily over everyone who had been involved in the search. The grief, the shock, the disbelief, these were emotions that were far too complex to explain with words alone. For those who had been following the case, the discovery felt like the very breath had been knocked out of them. The police officers, the investigators, the forensic team, all of them had been hoping for a different outcome. But now they were forced to confront the harsh reality. This was no ordinary missing child case. This was something far worse. The police officers working the scene knew the gravity of the discovery. For months, they had been searching for answers, following leads, checking tips, and looking for any sign that might bring them closer to the truth. But nothing had prepared them for this. Nothing had prepared them for the day they would open a suitcase and find a child who had been hidden away from the world, his life stolen in the most horrific way possible. As the forensic team moved in to examine the body, there was an eerie silence. The wind blew gently through the trees, but the atmosphere was heavy, suffocating. It was as if the entire world had paused to absorb the magnitude of what had just been uncovered. Jeremiah's death was not just the loss of a child. It was the loss of innocence itself. The shock of the discovery rippled through the community. There had been rumors. There had been whispers. There had been the distant hope that maybe, just maybe, the boy would be found alive. But now there was no denying it. Jeremiah Oliver was gone, and he had been gone for far too long. The community felt the weight of this moment. Neighbors who had once been so concerned about the boy's absence were now reeling from the knowledge of what had truly happened. Jeremiah's story was no longer a quiet mystery. It was a devastating tragedy, a tragedy that had been ignored for months, until the moment when the body was found in that suitcase. The police officers knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. They had the body. They had the evidence. But now, they had to unravel the truth behind this horrific crime. They had to figure out how a child, so innocent and so full of potential, had ended up in that suitcase. They had to find out who was responsible for taking his life, and why. Forensic investigators immediately began their work. They took photographs, carefully documented the crime scene, and began the long process of examining the body for any trace evidence that could help them piece together the events leading up to Jeremiah's death. The suitcase was bagged, tagged, and cataloged as evidence. It would be analyzed in the coming days, but for now, all anyone could do was stare in disbelief at what they had just uncovered. The discovery wasn't just a moment of sorrow, it was a turning point. It was the moment when the investigation, once clouded by uncertainty, finally began to take shape. The pieces were starting to come together. The body of Jeremiah Oliver had been found, and now the police had a starting point to uncover the truth behind his death. But with that discovery came another reality: the heartbreaking fact that the system had failed. Jeremiah's family, those who should have protected him, had failed him. The authorities had failed him. The system had failed him. And now, in the wake of this discovery, the truth had to be uncovered, no matter how painful it might be. The shock of the moment settled in as investigators, officers, and even community members stood in the background, processing what they had just seen. The suitcase was just an object. It was the body inside that mattered. The body of a young boy who never had a chance, who never got to live the life he deserved. Jeremiah's death was not an accident. It wasn't a random act of violence. It was the result of years of neglect, manipulation, and fear. It was the result of a system that had allowed this to happen. And now, the community, the investigators, and the world would have to confront the ugly truth. The forensic team continued their work, carefully preserving the scene and the evidence. Jeremiah's body would be taken to the medical examiner's office for a full autopsy, where the true cause of death would eventually be determined. But no matter what they found, one thing was already clear. Jeremiah's life had been stolen from him, and it was up to the authorities to find out who was responsible. As the day drew to a close, the suitcase was secured, and the team began to disperse. But the discovery of Jeremiah Oliver's body was only the beginning. The investigation was far from over. The truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered, and justice for Jeremiah would have to be pursued at all costs. For now, the only certainty was this: Jeremiah Oliver was no longer just a missing child. He was a victim whose life had been taken, whose story was far from over. The search for justice was about to begin. Can you imagine the shock the investigators must have felt when they opened that suitcase and found Jeremiah's body? What do you think went through their minds in that moment? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read and reply to every comment, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the case so far. Jeremiah's death didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a single act of violence, nor was it something that could be blamed on one person, one moment of rage, or one mistake. No, Jeremiah's suffering was the result of months of fear, manipulation, and control. Things that slowly built over time, piece by piece, until they culminated in the horrific end that we now know was inevitable. For months, Jeremiah lived in a home that was not a sanctuary, but a prison. A home that should have been full of love, laughter, and protection, but instead became a place of terror. The people he should have trusted the most, the people who should have cared for him, protected him, loved him, were the ones who inflicted the most harm. His mother, Elsa, and her boyfriend, Alberto Sierra, became the central figures in Jeremiah's nightmare. What started as a seemingly ordinary family situation, Elsa trying to rebuild her life after her marriage ended, turned into something far darker, far more twisted. Elsa, like many parents, was just trying to make the best decisions for her children. She wanted to provide a stable home for them. But in the case of Alberto, she allowed a man into their lives who had no business being around children. Alberto Sierra was a man with a history of violence, a man who had already shown signs of aggression, but who was allowed to take on a controlling, authoritative role in the household. And Jeremiah, the youngest of Elsa's children, was the one who bore the brunt of it. As the relationship between Elsa and Alberto deepened, the dynamics within the home shifted dramatically. Alberto wasn't just a partner to Elsa. He began to take on a role of dominance, controlling the household, including the children, with fear and intimidation. For Jeremiah, this wasn't just about an adult in the home making rules. It was about an adult who used those rules to manipulate, abuse, and terrorize him. Alberto's influence wasn't just about discipline. It was about control, emotional manipulation, and physical abuse. He made sure that Jeremiah, a 5-year-old boy, lived in constant fear. From the outside, things may have looked normal. From the outside, the family may have seemed like any other: a mother, a boyfriend, and children. But behind closed doors, the abuse was growing. It wasn't just the obvious signs of abuse that marked Jeremiah's time in that home. It wasn't just the bruises, the cuts, or the visible scars. It was the psychological abuse, the manipulation, the emotional torment that slowly wore down his sense of safety and well-being. As weeks passed, the tension in the household grew. Alberto's control over Elsa, and over the children, became more pronounced. What started as a subtle shift, a change in how decisions were made in the home, soon escalated into something far more toxic. Alberto became the authority figure in the house, and Elsa, the mother, began to fall under his control. She allowed it. She let him take over the household. She allowed him to dominate the children, even though deep down she must have known that something wasn't right. And yet she did nothing. She allowed it to happen. She allowed Alberto's manipulation to take root, and soon it wasn't just about controlling her. It was about controlling her children. The abuse wasn't just physical. It wasn't just about the times Alberto would hit or yell at Jeremiah. It was emotional. It was the way he made Jeremiah feel small, insignificant, and powerless. It was the way he took away his sense of security and replaced it with fear. It was the way he controlled every aspect of the boy's life. His actions, his thoughts, even his emotions. Jeremiah's life was dictated by fear. The fear of doing something wrong, the fear of upsetting Alberto, the fear of what might happen if he didn't obey. And this fear wasn't just about discipline. It was about survival. Elsa, for her part, was not innocent in all of this. She, too, was manipulated. She, too, allowed this environment to thrive, despite the warning signs. She allowed Alberto to become the dominant force in the household. She allowed him to control not only her but her children as well. And so the stage was set. Jeremiah, a sweet, innocent 5-year-old boy, was trapped in a home where fear ruled the day. He wasn't allowed to be a child. He wasn't allowed to play freely or dream of superheroes. He wasn't allowed to grow up in the way every child should. His world was shrinking, suffocated by the emotional and physical abuse that had begun to take root in his life. But the truth wasn't just about the abuse within the home. The truth was also about the systemic failures that allowed it all to continue unchecked. When the system failed Jeremiah, when the authorities failed him, they failed him in ways that are almost impossible to forgive. Social workers, child protective services, teachers. These are the people whose job it was to spot the signs of abuse, to intervene when something was wrong. But in this case, the system didn't just fail to protect him. It failed to notice at all. Before Jeremiah's disappearance, there had been signs. There had been reports from teachers and others who saw what was happening. But those reports went unnoticed, brushed aside, or simply ignored. Back in 2011, a neglect case had been opened on Elsa's family in Connecticut. Social workers had visited the home, documented concerns, and tried to offer help. But when the family moved to Massachusetts in 2013, the case was transferred to the Department of Children and Families in Fitchburg. The new social worker who took over the case didn't review the full history of the family. This omission would prove to be critical. The worker was unaware of the history of violence and the prior concerns, which should have raised a red flag. The worker's visits to the family home were sporadic at best. Though there were some visits, they were incomplete. The social worker was supposed to meet with Jeremiah and his siblings privately, but that didn't happen. The children were seen, but not interviewed. The safety of the children wasn't fully verified. No one questioned whether Jeremiah was in danger. The system, instead of intervening to protect him, had failed him at every step. The system was supposed to protect children like Jeremiah. That was its job. But instead of providing the help and support they needed, it stood by, passive and unaware, as his life became one of misery and fear. And when the community began to ask questions, when the teachers and neighbors started to notice the absence of a young boy who had once been so full of life, no one took the next step to dig deeper. The warning signs were everywhere, but no one had the courage to act in time. It's hard to imagine how the system could have let this happen. It's hard to fathom how so many people could miss the signs of abuse, how so many opportunities to intervene were simply overlooked. But for Jeremiah, every missed opportunity, every ignored concern, brought him closer to the horrible fate that awaited him. The truth, once revealed, was devastating. Jeremiah's life had been one of constant abuse. Physical, emotional, and psychological. His mother and her boyfriend had manipulated him, controlled him, and abused him in ways that were too horrific to comprehend. And the system, instead of stepping in to help, had allowed it to continue. As the investigation continued, the depths of this abuse became clearer. And though the pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to come together, the reality of what had happened to Jeremiah would haunt everyone involved for years to come. After hearing about the manipulation and control Jeremiah suffered at the hands of Elsa and Alberto, do you think Elsa could have done more to protect her son? What do you think could have prevented this tragedy from happening? Share your thoughts with me below. I read and reply to every comment, and I'm excited to hear what you all think. The medical examiner confirmed what investigators had suspected. Jeremiah's death was the result of violent trauma. That much was clear. But what wasn't clear, what investigators were struggling to understand, was the exact cause of death. Was it a single blow? Was it something else? Was there a way to understand just how a 5-year-old boy, full of life and promise, had ended up discarded like this, left in a suitcase on the side of a highway, far from anyone who could have saved him? When the forensic team first examined Jeremiah's body, they found no immediate signs of obvious trauma. Nothing that screamed this is the cause of death. There was no visible strangulation mark, no blunt force trauma that could be linked directly to the end of his life. These are the things we expect to see in cases of homicide. Clear, unmistakable signs that make it easy to draw conclusions. But for Jeremiah, the cause of death wasn't immediately clear. Forensic science is a meticulous process, and in cases like this, it's not just about finding one specific cause. It's about piecing together every single detail to understand what happened in those final moments of a child's life. The autopsy revealed that Jeremiah had been dead for some time before his body was found. His body had been exposed to the harsh elements for months, and by the time the forensic team examined him, the effects of decomposition had already started to take hold. This made the process of determining the exact cause of death far more difficult. In a case like this, time is the enemy. Every day that passes between death and discovery makes it harder to pinpoint the specifics of what happened. Despite the challenges, forensic experts found something that confirmed their suspicions. While there were no obvious external signs of how Jeremiah had died, the overall condition of his body was consistent with trauma. Though no specific marks could immediately explain the cause of death, the fact that he had been hidden away, discarded in such a brutal way, spoke volumes. The fact that Jeremiah's death was violent, was murder, was confirmed by the medical examiner's report. But even that certainty didn't offer any comfort. It only left more questions. What had happened to him? How had his life ended in this way? The medical examiner had to piece together every clue, every small fragment of evidence. They reviewed the condition of his body, looking for signs of injury. Marks on his skin, fractures in his bones, anything that could give them insight into what had happened. They studied the body for clues that might indicate how he was held, how he was abused, and how he was ultimately killed. But while the forensic team could confirm that Jeremiah had been the victim of homicide, they were left without a clear cause. No simple explanation would fit this case. No obvious weapon had been used. No single point of trauma that made everything clear. The fact that the body had been found after months of exposure also complicated things. The decomposition process meant that whatever clues had existed were now harder to interpret. Forensic experts examined Jeremiah's bones, his tissue, any residue that could still be found, and they came to a chilling conclusion. This was not a case of an accident. This was not the result of an illness or something that happened by chance. Jeremiah had been deliberately harmed. His death had been intentional. The forensic investigation revealed something else that was just as critical. Jeremiah had been moved. He hadn't just been left in that suitcase to die. The placement of his body, the way it had been discarded, showed that his killer had gone to great lengths to hide him. The suitcase had been placed along a highway, in an area so remote that few people ever traveled by it. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. They knew how to hide the body, how to make it difficult to find. They knew how to keep their actions hidden, even after the crime had been committed. But in the end, the forensic team couldn't answer the most important question. How did he die? The lack of clarity in the cause of death left investigators with an unsettling feeling. There was no simple explanation, no single wound that pointed to the killer's identity. There were no easy answers, and that only added to the emotional weight of the case. The forensic team could confirm that Jeremiah's death had been violent, but beyond that, the cause remained a mystery. For the investigators, this was a gut-wrenching moment. They had the body. They had the answers they needed to know that something tragic had happened to this child. But without a clear cause of death, it was hard to move forward. They couldn't definitively say how Jeremiah died or what had caused his suffering. All they knew for certain was that Jeremiah's life had been stolen from him in the most brutal way imaginable. As the days passed, the weight of the discovery sunk in even further. Jeremiah had been subjected to something far beyond the physical pain of the abuse. He had been neglected. He had been hidden away from the world, left to suffer alone in a suitcase, with no one coming to help. His body, his innocent body, was the final piece of evidence in this horrible puzzle. But it was an incomplete piece. The lack of clarity around the cause of death didn't mean that the investigation had stalled, but it did complicate things. It made everything harder. There was no weapon to trace. There was no clear indication of what happened to him in those final moments. The only thing they could confirm was that Jeremiah's death was the result of violent trauma. The only certainty was that someone had taken his life. The forensic report also revealed another unsettling detail. Jeremiah's body had been handled. Whoever had hidden him, whoever had discarded him in that suitcase, had moved him multiple times. The body had been repositioned and relocated, and the decomposition patterns suggested that this wasn't the first place he had been hidden. The more they uncovered, the more the case began to reveal itself. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was the result of careful planning, of manipulation, of someone who knew exactly how to control their victim and cover their tracks. It wasn't just the forensic evidence that was pointing the investigators toward a suspect. It was the way the crime had been carried out. The lack of a clear cause of death was painful, but the pattern of behavior, the way the body had been hidden, spoke volumes. Whoever did this had gone to great lengths to keep their actions hidden from the world. They had covered their tracks, hoping that no one would ever find out what had happened to little Jeremiah. And yet, despite the lack of clarity on how exactly he died, the investigation was beginning to take shape. The pieces were falling into place. The forensic evidence had confirmed the one thing that investigators had suspected all along. Jeremiah had been murdered. But that still left the ultimate question. Who did it? The forensic findings were a crucial piece of the puzzle. They had confirmed that Jeremiah had died violently, but without a clear cause, the investigation had to proceed with caution. What they did know, however, was this. Someone had hurt this child in ways no child should ever endure. Someone had taken Jeremiah's life, and they needed to be brought to justice. Now, as we close in on this devastating story, I just want to take a moment to thank all of you who have been with me on this journey. Producing these kinds of videos isn't easy. They take time, research, and passion. But with your support, we keep pushing forward, sharing these critical stories with the world. I'm so grateful for each one of you. If you feel as strongly as I do about the injustice that took place in this case, and you think the world needs to know the truth, please show your support, like this video, hit that subscribe button, and share it with someone who still believes in the power of justice. Every view, every share helps get these stories in front of the right people. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you're always the first to know when I drop another video. Trust me, there's so much more to come, and you won't want to miss it. The fight for justice was long and painful. It was a battle that seemed to drag on forever, as the legal system worked its way through the tragic details of Jeremiah Oliver's death. His body had been found, the evidence was clear, and yet, the road to justice felt like an agonizing crawl. One step forward, 2 steps back. Elsa Oliver, Jeremiah's mother, and her boyfriend, Alberto Sierra Jr., were both arrested and charged with crimes related to the abuse and murder of this innocent child. But despite the charges, despite the horrific facts laid out before the court, the legal proceedings were slow, and the emotional burden they carried for everyone involved was immense. Elsa, once a mother who had promised to care for and protect her children, now stood accused of failing to protect Jeremiah. She had allowed a man with a violent past into her home, and she had allowed him to take control of her family. For that, she was charged with reckless endangerment and child abuse. But the charges against Elsa were only part of the story. Alberto Sierra, who had been more than just a boyfriend, he had been a figure of authority in the home, was charged with even more serious offenses. He was accused of being the primary perpetrator of the violence against Jeremiah. His role in the abuse, in the manipulation, and in the murder was undeniable. He stood accused of the murder of a helpless 5-year-old, a crime that shook the community to its core. The legal process began with a sense of urgency. The charges were serious, and the evidence against both Elsa and Alberto was mounting. But as the trial began to unfold, it became clear that justice would not come quickly. The wheels of the legal system turned slowly, grinding through the complex layers of this case. Each day in court felt like another day of waiting, of hoping, of fearing that justice would be delayed or denied. For the families involved, for the investigators, and for the entire community, the process felt like a painful reminder of what had been lost. Jeremiah's death was not just the result of the actions of one person. It was the result of a system that had failed him. The legal proceedings were not just about holding Elsa and Alberto accountable. They were about finding justice for a little boy who never had the chance to live a full life. Throughout the trial, the defense team for both Elsa and Alberto sought to downplay their roles in the death of Jeremiah. They argued that Elsa, though guilty of neglect, had not been directly responsible for her son's death. Alberto's defense team sought to portray him as someone who had simply lost control in a moment of anger, someone who had acted out of desperation or frustration. But despite their efforts to minimize the severity of their actions, the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses took the stand. Investigators detailed the abuse that had taken place within the household. Forensic experts described the signs of trauma on Jeremiah's body, confirming that he had been the victim of prolonged abuse. And as the court heard more about the circumstances leading to Jeremiah's death, it became increasingly clear that this was not a simple case of neglect. It was a case of cold, calculated cruelty. Throughout the proceedings, the pain of the community was palpable. Families who had once known and loved Jeremiah were now forced to confront the devastating reality of his death in a public forum. They listened as the details of his final months were revealed. How he had been trapped in a home where fear and violence reigned. How he had suffered in silence. How no one had come to his aid in time. But despite the overwhelming evidence, the trial continued to drag on. It wasn't just the legal proceedings that weighed heavily on everyone involved. It was the emotional toll of reliving the details of Jeremiah's life and death. Every witness statement, every forensic report, every moment in court was another reminder of the life that had been stolen. The prosecution, however, remained determined. They knew the facts and they knew the truth. The evidence was irrefutable. But in the courtroom, they faced a battle against more than just defense attorneys. They faced a battle against the systemic failures that had allowed Jeremiah's death to happen in the first place. Every mistake made by Child Protective Services, every missed opportunity for intervention, every failure to act. These were all things that weighed heavily on the case, even though they were not directly part of the legal argument. Elsa's role as a mother, as someone who should have protected her children, was central to the case. She had allowed Alberto, a man with a violent history, to become a primary influence in their home. She had allowed the abuse to continue, choosing to turn a blind eye rather than intervene. The prosecution argued that this failure to act was not just neglect, it was complicity. Elsa had the power to stop the violence, but she chose not to. And for that, she had to be held accountable. As the trial dragged on, the courtroom became a battleground of emotions. The community was torn. Some stood behind Elsa, believing she had been manipulated and controlled by Alberto. Others, however, saw her as a willing accomplice to the abuse, someone who had failed to protect her own child. The emotional weight of the case was staggering, and it left everyone involved questioning how such a tragedy could have been allowed to happen. For the community, the trial was about more than just justice for Jeremiah. It was about reckoning with their own failures. How had they all missed the signs? How had they allowed this boy's suffering to continue for so long, without stepping in to help? How had the system failed him, time and time again? In the midst of the trial, a decision was made that would shape the outcome. In 2017, Elsa Oliver pleaded guilty to charges of assault and battery, as well as 2 counts of reckless endangerment. She was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison, but her plea deal came with a controversial twist. She avoided the more serious charge of homicide, a charge that many felt she deserved. Alberto Sierra Jr., on the other hand, faced separate charges, including assault and related offenses involving his conduct with Jeremiah and the other children. He, too, would plead guilty in 2017. His sentence was 6 to 7 years in prison, with additional time for parole. The judge took into account his violent past, his role in the abuse, and the undeniable cruelty he had inflicted on a child who had never had a chance to defend himself. Despite these convictions, the community's pain remained. The sentences for Elsa and Alberto, though significant, felt inadequate in the face of what had happened to Jeremiah. The community had been forced to face the truth about what had happened behind closed doors, but the punishment felt insufficient compared to the enormity of the crime. Jeremiah's death was not a single act. It was the result of months of emotional and physical abuse, neglect, and manipulation. And for many, the sentences handed down to Elsa and Alberto seemed to pale in comparison to the life that had been lost. In the years following the trial, there were questions about whether justice had truly been served. While Elsa and Alberto were held accountable for their roles in the abuse, many felt that the case had never fully addressed the systemic failures that had allowed this tragedy to unfold. The system that was supposed to protect children like Jeremiah had failed him at every turn. And for many, that failure was as painful as the murder itself. The case didn't just end with a conviction. It left behind a trail of grief, unanswered questions, and a community that would never forget the boy who had been lost. Jeremiah's death had exposed the flaws in the system, the deep cracks in the institutions that were supposed to protect children. And as the community mourned his loss, they were left to grapple with the question: how could this happen to an innocent child? Though Elsa and Alberto were convicted and sent to prison, their sentences didn't bring back what was lost. What mattered most was the memory of a little boy who never had a chance, a little boy whose life was taken far too soon, and whose death served as a painful reminder of the failures of a system that should have protected him. The search for justice wasn't just about the court case. It was about finding a way to prevent this from ever happening again. Jeremiah's story was one of tragic loss, but also of lessons learned too late. His death would never be forgotten. It would serve as a catalyst for change, a call to action for those who had the power to protect children like him. Jeremiah's story is a painful reminder that the most dangerous people are sometimes the ones closest to us. It's easy to think that danger lurks outside, that harm comes from strangers, from people we don't know. But in Jeremiah's case, the greatest threat to his life came from those who should have loved him the most: his own family. His mother, Elsa, and her boyfriend, Alberto, were the ones who caused him the greatest harm. Jeremiah's story is not just one of tragedy, it's a warning. It's a call for all of us to pay attention to the children around us, to be vigilant, and to act when we see something that doesn't feel right. This case will stay with us, not just as a painful chapter in history, but as a reminder of the importance of child protection and the duty we all have to care for the most vulnerable among us. For Jeremiah, there will never be a chance to grow up, to chase his dreams, to become the man he could have been. His life was taken, and the justice that followed, while important, can never bring him back. But it's crucial that we remember him, that we keep his voice alive, even in the face of such unimaginable loss. This case should serve as a catalyst for change. It should push us to question the systems that failed Jeremiah, the authorities who missed opportunities to intervene, and the community that turned a blind eye when they should have acted. But above all, Jeremiah's story is a call to action for all of us. We can't change the past, but we can use his memory to make sure that children today and in the future have the protection and care they deserve. We can work together to make sure that no other child has to suffer the way Jeremiah did. Please share this video. Let's make sure that Jeremiah's voice is never forgotten. Let's keep his story alive, and let's raise awareness about the importance of protecting our children from harm. If you want to stay updated on this case and others like it, please subscribe to the channel. Share this video, and let's keep this conversation alive. Every story shared, every voice raised, could be the one that saves a life. Because the truth is, the more we talk about these stories, the more we protect the children who still need us. And the more we make sure that they're never forgotten, never neglected, and never abandoned like Jeremiah was. Together, we can honor his memory and ensure that his story sparks change. Thank you for watching and thank you for caring.